Hello everyone. Thank you very much for this reception. It is a great honor for me to be in this house, sharing the experience of Argentina. At the time we came to power, Argentina was basically on the brink of what would have been the worst crisis in its history, combining elements of the three largest crises in Argentine history. Furthermore, we had a monetary imbalance that was double what it was in 1975, before the Rodrigazo. We had a much more precarious situation at the central bank than we had in 1989. Before Alfonsin's hyperinflation, and we had worse social indicators than we had at the end of convertibility. Therefore, everything was ripe for a real explosion. At the same time, Argentina was showing twin deficits equivalent to 17 points of GDP. You know that the literature on early crisis indicators indicates that a twin deficit of 4 points, in terms of GDP, is a yellow alert. In the case of 8 points of GDP, it portends a tremendous crisis. So imagine what it was like to face 17 points. At the same time, of those 17 points, 15 were generated by the national public sector, where 5 corresponded to the fiscal deficit generated by the Treasury, and 10 points corresponded to the quasi-fiscal deficit, that is, the deficit generated by the central bank. This, moreover, occurred in a context where the central bank had negative net international reserves of nearly $12 billion. We had debts with importers of $50 billion. We had outstanding dividends of $10 billion. We had debt maturities, in pesos, equivalent to $90 billion. Debt maturities, in dollars, for $25 billion. Mainly with multilateral organizations, but we had the agreement with the International Monetary Fund voided due to the previous administration's successive defaults. And, in addition, we had, on the central bank's balance sheet, interest-bearing liabilities equivalent to 4 monetary bases maturing within 1 day. In short, everything was set up for a true catastrophe. However, we never complained about the legacy. We only described it, because we also have to be honest that, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, I wouldn't be president. Under normal conditions, there wouldn't be liberal libertarian presidents, and that's why there never were any in the world. That's why I am the first liberal libertarian president in the history of humanity. In that sense, at the same time, inflation was running, when one looked at the first week of December, at a rate of 1% per day. That's close to 3,700% annually. In the first 2 weeks of December, inflation was already running at an annual rate of 7,500%, and wholesale inflation for the month of December had reached 54%, which, annualized, was 17,000%. This was absolutely feasible, given the monetary imbalance Argentina was experiencing, in which, under normal conditions, Argentina would have validated monetarily. Therefore, to avoid the catastrophe that would have caused hyperinflation, we needed to quickly cut off monetary issuance. In that sense, the first thing we undertook, on the Treasury side, was a strong fiscal adjustment, and we set a goal of achieving a zero deficit. The zero deficit goal, in financial terms, implies that the debt does not grow further. If the debt does not grow, the debt to GDP ratio is non-increasing. Thus, the country becomes a solvent debtor and, therefore, creditworthy. That task we had set ourselves, in our first year in office, everyone told us was impossible. That it was impossible for us to make a 5-point GDP adjustment, that only, in the best case scenario, a 1-point GDP adjustment was possible. Furthermore, in the last 123 years of its history, Argentina posted a fiscal deficit in 113 years. And in the 10 years it had a surplus. That surplus is misleading because Argentina was in default and wasn't paying interest. And surprisingly, and thanks to the enormous work of my outstanding Minister of Economy, Luis Tota Caputo, who is here, we achieved financial equilibrium in the first month of my administration. Today, we've already had 8 months of financial surplus. We've managed to reduce country risk from 2,900 points to 1,300, with a downward trend and an unwavering commitment to public finances. In fact, a few days ago, I was forced to veto an irresponsible pension increase by Congress. Incredibly, while pensions lost nearly 40% in real terms during the previous administration, and have gained more than 5% in real terms during our administration, they voted for a law that implied an increase in public spending of at least 1.2% of GDP. Furthermore, they hadn't proposed any financing mechanism, making it an absolutely irresponsible situation, and this, in dynamic terms, meant increasing the debt to GDP ratio by 67% of GDP. In other words, it directly meant exterminating the future of young people with an absolutely unpayable debt. Therefore, our commitment to fiscal balance is unwavering. And we are not willing to negotiate, under any circumstances, fiscal balance. This fiscal balance, over the months, allowed us not only to save the program with the International Monetary Fund, but, at the same time, it allowed us to build a peso curve, and in that context, we began the cleanup of the central bank, since 2/3 of the deficit was generated by the central bank. And that implied endogenous money creation, which also fueled inflation. We had already cut off the Treasury's issuance channel. So now we had to begin cutting off the central bank's issuance channels. And that task, which no one mentioned, which no one dared to point out how it would be resolved, in a gigantic, Cyclops-like undertaking, our central bank president, Santiago Basile, managed to eliminate the quasi-fiscal deficit in 7 months, along with the enormous work done by our Secretary of Finance, Dr. Pablo Cuerno, and, from now on, Argentina no longer issues currency to finance the treasury or the quasi-fiscal deficit. Therefore, we were in a position to move, not only now, toward a zero-deficit situation, but we were in a position to move toward a situation of zero excess supply of money. This meant that we were in a position to issue currency only against the purchase of dollars, and in that context, basically, what we considered was that this issuance had a demand for money as a counterpart, and that, consequently, this would not lead to a loss of the currency's purchasing power and, therefore, would work well to lower inflation. However, as we progressed, we realized that, strictly speaking, given the capital controls that still persist, although they are much lower than what we had when we started, just to give you an order of magnitude, when we arrived, only 15% of imports were paid for, and today, 95% of imports are paid for. And, in that sense, we still have stock problems to resolve, and this has consequences for the design of monetary policy, which I will explain in a moment. But one of the things we realized is that, when you have free capital movement, those who bring in dollars are buying pesos, and they buy those pesos to make transactions. And that's why it doesn't generate inflation. However, when you have capital controls, that transaction isn't so much buying pesos, but rather selling dollars because you're obligated to. Those pesos you're issuing now don't necessarily have a demand for money, and therefore, the remainder is what's generating inflation. Faced with this situation, we decided to radicalize our monetary policy and go directly to a zero-emission level, that is, to keep the money supply constant. Naturally, this has already had consequences. And you can see it because wholesale inflation today is at 2.1%. This means that from traveling at an annualized inflation rate of 17,000%, we're now at levels of 2%, which is 28% annually. Which is a true feat because we've done this without fixing the exchange rate, without controlling prices, or even without controlling the exchange rate. Without prior hyperinflation, which would allow the reconstruction of money demand and facilitate stabilization, without violating property rights and in the process, restoring relative prices to prices that had been crushed by the previous administration. That is why I always say that my Minister of Economy, of whom I am so proud, drive. Luis Toto Caputo will be remembered as the best Minister of Economy in history, because what he is doing is truly an enormous task. That said, in the face of this new monetary policy framework, we were questioned about whether there was, now, market intervention, and we were questioned about the issue of reserve accumulation. Regarding intervention, given that we still have capital controls, what I can say is that the level of intervention has decreased now because in a world without intervention, what would the world be like without intervention? The exchange rate would be free. The change in the quantity of money would be zero, and the change in reserves would be zero. In that context, the parallel exchange rate is free in Argentina. Not only that, but previously, since we forced exporters to liquidate their dollars, for every $3 we bought, we were intervening for 3. Today, since we keep the quantity of pesos constant, we were initially returning basically $2, so intervention had fallen by a third. Today, the gap is much smaller, and intervention levels basically continue to fall. Therefore, far from there being more intervention, there is less intervention. At the same time, we're being questioned about the issue of reserve accumulation. And the truth is that it's a rather ridiculous and conceptually flawed argument because the question is, if that argument were true, would it mean that all countries with free exchange rates would default, which is a huge nonsense? Basically, our argument is that dollars to pay debt service must be purchased with fiscal surpluses. They must be purchased with fiscal discipline, with fiscal savings, not with monetary issuance, because when you buy them with monetary issuance, what you're really doing is defrauding citizens. Because, on the one hand, you buy dollars, you inject pesos, but those dollars that the central bank has purchased with peso issuance, the government then places bonds on the central bank. In fact, the nation's largest creditor is the central bank. During the last administration, the Treasury stole $45 billion from the central bank, and therefore from the Argentine people. And therefore we're not going to allow that scam. The time has come for the Argentine state to defraud, primarily, good Argentines and their creditors. Therefore, dollars will be purchased with fiscal surpluses, not with a hidden inflationary tax. That said, we have not only worked on stabilizing the macroeconomic situation, but another of the major demands, which I described as shocking, as president, was not only to tame inflation, which is on the way, but we also had an agenda to reduce insecurity. Argentina seemed like a no-man's land. It seemed impossible to control the marches, the pickets, and all those illegal activities, which obstructed good Argentines' ability to work peacefully. And in that sense, I also want to recognize the enormous work of my Minister of Security, Dr. Patricia Bullrich, who is also here with us, who, in response to the first march, developed the anti-picket protocol. And, from then on, not a single street was blocked in Argentina. And, in fact, we've gone 4 months without a single picket. In other words, they've completely given up. Not only that, but in the province of Santa Fe, the city of Rosario, a hotbed of drug trafficking, last month saw 0 homicides and has seen an 80% drop since the implementation of Plan Bandera. Therefore, we're also fulfilling that part of what the shock description of ending insecurity required. Not only that, but from the campaign itself, we've had a clear international position. What's more, we always said we were going to be allied with the free world, that we were going to stand against the autocrats. Even as a congressman, I had spoken out in favor of Ukraine against the Russian invasion, and, furthermore, my alignment with the United States was so clear, regardless of who will govern the United States, because it's a strategic decision to be an ally of the United States. As a representative of the free world, we also said that we were going to align ourselves with Israel. We also stated that we were going to align ourselves with the free world and that we were going to flatly reject the 2030 agenda and everything related to the woke catechism. In that sense, yesterday, my magnificent foreign minister, Dr. Diana Mondino, who is here, gave a real lesson on why the United Nations should not stray from its original objective of maintaining peace and should stop embracing the entire socialist agenda, which only leads to impoverishment. Therefore, yesterday, we also gave strong demonstrations of our alignment not only with the free world, but also with the ideas of free market capitalism. Naturally, our social policy is also questioned. They say we have no heart. I would say those who make that comment have no brains. In fact, they didn't like my last post on Instagram about the K-12 virus very much. But beyond that, the only items that grew sharply during our administration were those related to social containment spending. We knew that making the largest fiscal adjustment in human history meant putting the social situation at risk, and there we have not only doubled the items. In fact, regarding Argentina's 2 most important plans, the Universal Child Allowance and the Food Card, not only have they doubled and more, but today, they cover the entire basic food basket. Therefore, this represents a substantial improvement compared to what the populist government, so concerned about the people, only covered half of. Not only that, but also, in the middle, we eliminated the intermediaries, the managers of poverty, that is, those who kept part of the money that went to the most vulnerable sectors. And, obviously, touching those privileges, touching those thefts, generated many press operations against our government. Press operations that, moreover, are overstimulated simply because we cut off their advertising. We believe in true freedom, not that a government has to bribe journalists to get them to say what it wants. If they're so good, they should compete in the market and win the favor of consumers, as all good companies do in their market. But this isn't all. We also initiated a series of structural reforms, promoting the basic law and sending a decree of necessity and urgency, through which we managed to pass these reforms with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and 10% of the Senate. It's incredible that they still question our lack of management. I must also deeply thank Drive Guillermo Francos, who is in Buenos Aires, for his leadership in everything related to politics and for achieving such results. Why are these reforms important? First, because these reforms are 8 times larger than the reform implemented in the 1990s by Carlos Saul Menem. Menem's reform was the largest in history. Today, the largest structural reform in history is the one we are implementing, which we did in just 6 months. That will mean Argentina will climb nearly 80 places, in terms of economic freedom, and in terms of the functioning of the system, we will begin to resemble countries like Germany, Italy, and France. But that's not enough for us. We plan to be the freest country in the world. And to achieve that, we still have 3,200 structural reforms pending, which, when we complete them, will undoubtedly make us the freest country in the world. In that regard, I also want to highlight the enormous work being done by another of my great ministers, Dr. Federico Sturzenegger, where, day by day, we are deregulating and removing obstacles to the economy. Therefore, have no doubt that we will give everything to make the freest country in the world, because the freest countries are 12 times richer than the repressed ones, have twice the growth rate, and have 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. Therefore, if Argentina wants to climb out of the hole that socialism sank us into, what we need is to re-embrace the city of liberty, something we already did, because Argentina embraced the ideas of liberty in 1860, which was when the Alberti Constitution of 1853 was implemented. And from being a country of barbarians, in 35 years, we became the world's leading power. So, with a more integrated world, better connected, and with far greater technological possibilities to accelerate convergence, why wouldn't we do it now? All we need is courage, and, believe me, if there's one thing I have plenty of, it's courage to do it. Finally, the question is, how will they grow? The first point is that growth or expansion will have 2 parts. One part will have to do with cyclical recovery. In fact, today, when one looks at the economic series, 80% of the series are beginning to show positive results. In other words, the Argentine activity map is beginning to turn, almost entirely, green. And this is partly due to the fact that a cyclical recovery is occurring. For the past 5 months, wages have been systematically beating inflation, that is, we have seen an improvement in real wages. This also applies to pensions. At the same time, Lowering inflation is eliminating the distortion that inflation generates in the functioning of the price system. In fact, I also want to mention something, because the Argentine experience also shows something interesting in terms of stabilization. That the healthy way to correct inflation is not by raising the interest rate, but by stopping printing money. Because what we need to understand is that the interest rate exists, regardless of the existence of money. The interest rate exists because time exists. Not because there is a central bank printing money. And that was a very important element, because if we ignored the recommendations to raise the interest rate as a stabilization mechanism, we would have had a monetary liability ratio, in terms of the monetary base, of nearly 10 times today, and we would be discussing the characteristics of the Argentine catastrophe, and not how Argentina managed to end inflation. But sometimes it's necessary to return to the roots, to reread the authors of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Before the appearance of the aberration of 1936, called the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, by that sinister being John Maynard Keynes. That said, I'm Milei. What did you expect? That said, we also have an element working in our favor, which is the recomposition of stocks. Therefore, the Argentine economy had been overstocked. During the latter part of the Kirchner administration, in case hyperinflation broke out, and to be protected with real assets. And those stocks were depleted in the first half of the year, and therefore, today the stock cycle is playing a positive role, as is the recovery in demand, via salary increases and pension increases, which is manifesting itself in the increasing level of installed capacity utilization in different sectors of the economy. But clearly, that contributes to the cycle. But that's not all. There's more, and there are more things that will favor economic growth. First, growth is generated by investment. And you have to finance that investment. That is, you need savings. And basically, the fiscal adjustment we've implemented has returned 15 points of GDP in savings to Argentines. In other words, while, in December of last year, we were discussing the characteristics of hyperinflation, today we are discussing the existence of 30-year loans and how 30-year loans are structured. Therefore, this shows that banks have stopped being offices for financing, indirectly the Treasury, and have had to go out and work as bankers, which is what we wanted them to do. On the other hand, this will be a major factor for economic growth. At the same time, we're going to lift the controls. We're going to lift the controls when the inflation rate, which is the macroeconomic program, is zero. Basically, you have an observed consumer inflation rate of 4% and an inflation induced by the program, given capital controls, the crawling peg, and international inflation, of 2.5%. Therefore, that inflation rate today is at 1.5. When that 1.5 has disappeared, a situation will arise where the LAFIS have also disappeared and the monetary base, in the traditional format, coincides with the broad monetary base. At that point, the money overhang will have disappeared, and we will be able to open the currency controls without any problems, because they will no longer have bullets to load the weapons that could undermine macroeconomic stability. Because the excess pesos within the economy will have been eliminated. At the same time, our fiscal discipline will mean that, inexorably, the country risk will fall. In fact, when we were discussing the impacts of what Congress Congress is doing, we noticed that every time the country risk rises by 100 basis points, GDP, in dollars, falls 1.8 and falls 0.6 in pesos. That means, for example, if we were to go back to the old ways proposed by the degenerate prosecutors in the Argentine National Congress, it would mean losing a third of GDP. It would mean losing close to $200 billion. I will not allow them to do so. I will veto all of them, all of the excesses they want to commit when they want to attack the fiscal result. And the consequence of this will be that, inexorably, country risk will fall, the interest rate will drop, and consequently, we will accelerate capital accumulation, productivity will increase, and the Argentine economy will grow and recover its wages. And one last note on the exchange rate controls. Unlike all the other experiences that resulted from shifting from the official exchange rate to the parallel exchange rate, we are demonstrating that it can be done from the parallel exchange rate to the official exchange rate. When we launched the Zero Emission Program, we were basically facing a situation where the parallel exchange rate was at 1,500. While analysts' forecasts said it would reach 2,000 in the coming weeks. Today, the parallel exchange rate is at 1,200, and in some measurements at 1,190, while the official exchange rate, corrected by the country tax, is around 1,100. In other words, today, the gap is narrowing to less than 10%. Therefore, when we said we were going to close the gap, from the top down, we are delivering. The day we finish lifting the currency controls, the excess demand for foreign currency will be closed, and therefore, the excess supply in the bond market will be closed, and therefore, bond prices will rise. Interest rates will fall. The excess supply in the goods market will be closed. There will be an additional expansion in economic activity. The excess supply of labor will also be curbed, and therefore, there will be higher wages with more jobs and, therefore, fewer poor and destitute people. Therefore, I want to tell you that Argentina is standing up, embracing the ideas of freedom. We are committed to building the best government in history. We are committed to being a beacon of light for the ideas of freedom, so that everyone puts aside socialist ideas and once again embraces the ideas of freedom, and we are convinced that we will achieve it. So, thank you very much. Long live freedom, damn it.